Hi, good afternoon. I'm Vince Dasta. I'm a director at Protiviti and also the chair of the Chicago chapter of the FAIR Institute. Looking forward to giving this presentation with Matt here to talk about presenting to the board. Just a little bit of background about myself. As I mentioned, I'm the chair of the Chicago chapter of the FAIR Institute. Been involved with the FAIR Institute now for the last few years, and in my day job at Protiviti, I lead our cyber risk quantification practice, where we help clients operationalize and build programs around cyber risk quantification. Matt?
Matt Kruse. I'm a senior director with FIS. I'm in charge of our shared services function in our risk department. For us, we spell RISC, R-I-S-C, which stands for Risk, Information Security, and Compliance. And our shared services function handles risk assessment, project management, risk reporting, and systems automation. So as you might imagine, FAIR and this concept of quantitative risk assessment is something that we've been interested in for some time.
Great. Well, Matt, I know you wanted to share a little bit of your experience presenting to your board, kind of tell your journey a little bit and talk about, how you ended up in this environment and what drove this. If you want, I'm going to go ahead and share some slides here. So give me 1 second to get that queued up. Yeah. So Matt, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about the background and how did you get to the point where you are today?
Absolutely. So as many companies represented at FairCon this year, FIS is a company that's grown over time, and in particular over the past 5 years through large acquisitions. And so it was really just after a large acquisition last year that we were bringing our now new risk and technology committee board members together for the first time to do a deep dive on our risk and information security and compliance reporting. And as they expressed excitement about the combination of the two companies and our forward-looking vision towards being an even larger, Fortune 500 company, the sort of question on their mind, the fundamental question was, how do we understand the amount of risk that we face as a newly combined company? Where does that risk profile look different now that we're bringing two companies together? And how can we be certain that we're looking at the most important things that deserve our attention and that we actually can add something to that oversight function? And as we began to talk about our risk metrics, many of which are complicated, many of which take quite a bit of explanation to understand the underlying components and data that go into them, a theme began to emerge. And what we began to hear from the board was, I'm understanding that we've got a lot of metrics and a lot of reporting. And I understand that we've got a really mature compliance program, but I'm not so sure that I can understand how I compare risk across domains. And you think about when you bring two companies together, if you're adding net new services, you might have a whole new type of risk that didn't exist before that merger. And again, how do I compare information security risk, which we understand is obviously one that's of paramount importance to us as a company, but how do I put that into context without having to really spend days and days and perhaps even weeks of my board's time getting them focused and really understanding those metrics that you're presenting. So what we kind of took away from that was our PAC may be too compliance focused and not enough time and focus spent on the actual magnitude of risk. How much risk are we facing and how does that compare across? And then what our board members also mentioned is that in other companies that they also sit on the board for, in particular, large Fortune 100 companies, they had already seen a shift towards quantitative metrics, risk expressed in terms of dollars and frequency, and that facilitated really a business discussion around risk reduction. And that was the kind of discussion that they wanted to see applied. And then maybe the last piece, Vince, that I think also fits well with this discussion is they wanted to see a framework, something that was ultimately going to be not only something they could understand from a definition perspective and a how did you do the math, but something that they would routinely see then, board meeting after board meeting, along with the way that a framework would really specify a process. So having a structured framework to go along with that dollar value of magnitude and that expression of frequency. That was really the message we heard from the board.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is, as you were talking about this, and taking a financial services company that has been very focused on compliance, kind of the, let's call it maturity-based assessment of risk, and and starting to transform that so that you can actually start to make comparisons and understand the risks. I think one of the things that you mentioned that I'd love you to elaborate on is being able to compare the risks that you're talking about from a cyber perspective or an operational perspective or a compliance perspective, and be able to compare those and understand how those look. I mean, is that something that you've struggled with in the past, or was that kind of a new ask? How did you take that?
Well, I think it's difficult when you have to step back and look at your program from afar and from a new lens. And sometimes, you begin to think to yourself, where is it a struggle, or where is it something that's, kind of net new? I would say my answer to that one, Vince, is really we've classically kind of styled our program after a financial services company. And I think in many senses, we then think in terms of these set domains. And you mentioned
Yeah.
a couple of them: information security, regulatory and compliance risk, operational and process risk, and then of course, strategic risk. And we've almost looked at them as being separate. Even though we understood there was overlap in between, we would really report on them separately. And so I think it was an aha moment for all of us sitting around the table that we needed to bring it together. We needed a way to be able to roll up risk that would allow us to add more insight than we have a bunch of green on our compliance metrics, or we have a bunch of high or critical risk concentrated in a number of areas without a way to really meaningfully compare one versus the other. So I think that was the aha moment.
So, you're talking, you get this ask, you're hearing this feedback from your board, so how do you go about addressing this? It's one thing to understand the ask, but I think what I see with a lot of clients is, how do we take that first step? How do we start to address these things? So maybe you could talk a little bit of, kind of about, why did you settle on FAIR, and how did the risk analysis kind of concepts come out in the wash?
Well, it happened in this session as we were going through, and keep in mind, we had gone into this session really with a set agenda in mind. And we had our handbook of metrics, which is, 50 pages deep. And we were planning to spend, 5 hours going into each and every one of these metrics. And it was really early on. It was probably within the first hour as we began to really go in deep that the board said, this really isn't what we're after. And as soon as they talked about quantification in dollar terms, a light bulb went off. A couple of years ago, we kind of as a company and a risk organization in particular, we're looking at what does the future look like related to risk assessment. And the one thing that we kept finding in the industry was FAIR. FAIR was the one model that appeared to be on its pathway to an industry standard, and one that certainly put it into the context that we're describing here. And quite frankly, for those of you who are at this conference, I know you've read the book, and the foreword by Jack talks about how the board asked him that very question, right? How do I understand how much risk I have? Help me to quantify it. And so I felt like it was deja vu, like literally I'm reading from the intro of the book, and there I am. And so I decided in that moment to do something that maybe is a bit of a risk, not to overuse the term, but I felt like I should go ahead and throw out this idea that FAIR might be part of that answer. And again, fortunately, we had been looking into it. So I had enough depth of understanding, having read the book, that I could walk my way through the ontology, and I could talk about how we would apply it without knowing, of course, the tactical details of what we would need to get into. And so that's what we did in that session. We actually introduced FAIR to the board at that point, talked about how it might fit, and how other companies that we've seen are using it. Yeah. And I had talked to, I want to say prior to concluding that research, we had talked to about 10 or 15 of our peers just to see, are other people using this? Are they making real decisions? And I'll tell you, Vince, the vast majority they had had some type of pilot, some type of effort where they had actually gone down the path of FAIR. And so I knew I was speaking from a place of, industry best practice.
Yeah.
And so what we laid out for the board was, we're going to find an expert to work with. We're going to look at this not as something that we can develop just organically in-house, because we don't have experience running these models and leveraging them in our decision making. We wanted to go find a partner. And I think that's where really the engagement took off from a top risk assessment perspective.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I appreciate that. And I think one of the things that struck me about, the pilot that we conducted together in response to this ask was the way that you set out to manage expectations. And I think that this is something that is really challenging with a lot of organizations when they start to, adopt these methods and they start to explore these as options, but I think, you took a very interesting approach to it. And I think understanding at the very beginning that the goal of any of this risk analysis or any of this work is to ultimately help the business make decisions in an informed way, right? And I think the way that you laid out this approach of, risk analysis, being reduction of uncertainty for a cost, but then also clearly defining, what are your goals? Why are we doing this pilot or this proof of concept? And also, I think managing to the expectations around, some of the challenges that you expect to encounter as you go through this. So maybe you could talk a little bit about this and how you set this pilot project up to kind of your team at FIS and back to the board.
At the end of the day, we really wanted to be able to take that set of core 3 questions that you see on slide and make them real for the board. So, we started by asking the board to really consider 3 questions as we played back this analysis for them. Is it useful? And really the question underneath that question is, we've all received in our inbox a project list for the next quarter, for the next half year, the upcoming year's budget. And that project list has nothing but critical and high projects. And you begin to ask yourself the question, if everything is critical, if everything is high, and I'm not suggesting that everything on your list isn't critical and high, but if everything is, how can I actually distinguish what we need to be focused on? How can I prioritize and make better decisions about what we are or are not going to do? Because we all know as risk practitioners, our budget isn't unlimited. There are controls that we want to install and we may not be able to get funding to do it. So really being able to make sense of those ordinal scales was something that we felt like that would be useful. If we could drive that into our decision making, that would be useful. And then, is it practical? So, here we've got, as I mentioned before, an awful lot of data that we've got at our disposal. So, when I'm thinking about this risk assessment and whether or not I should make a decision, have I been thoughtful in following a set path, a framework, an ontology to make sure that I'm looking at not just the possibility of that risk becoming real, but the probability? And have I considered the threats and my vulnerability, as well as how frequently it could happen? So is it practical? And of course, that also addresses that core issue of, can I do it? And if I can't do it, if I don't have enough data, or it's too complicated to actually run for the scenarios that I've got, then it's not practical to actually be done. And that final one, are the results defensible, is really around having a methodology that you can explain, that isn't a black box. And frankly, if you're going to be successful, everyone in the business, not just risk, but your business lines as well, have to be able to engage with it, interact with it, and frankly, be able to perform it. And that's what makes that defensible so darn important. And I think the final point, Vince, for me is really this idea that I wanted to simplify the story, because too often it gets very complicated when you start talking about quantification. As soon as you mention things like Monte Carlo simulation, to certain folks, you've lost them, right? The audience has moved on because it's just not germane to the decision making they're looking to make. And so I wanted to impress upon them decisions are going to happen, whether we use quantification or not. The key is us finding the best possible information to give you an informed decision. And quantification, in many respects, really delivers that, as well as really answers those three powerful and I think simple questions as well. It gives you a model that you can work from.
No, that's good. Yeah, and I think that it's a great point. And and as you talk about that, and we put this back in the context of giving the board information, and letting them understand how you're making the decisions that you're making as a management team, I think is really important. And and if you talk about it, and I know you mentioned kind of your the way that you were reporting this before, tables of metrics. These are all relatively technical things. They're all, control frame things, right? Effectiveness of the controls and the way that these things are working. That's really hard to do, right? I mean, and I think you mentioned the feedback that you got from this is that it's just not useful information, right? And I think when we talk about this, and this is a pretty common thing that we see as well, is that we're presenting this this information because we're trying to answer the question: how much risk do we have? What are our risks? What's our exposure to these risks, right? And it's what we're doing is we're trying to present things that we think are going to imply that, right? We're being able to show how our controls are working, and we're implicitly saying that if our controls are effective, then risk is low, but it doesn't really tell us what we're explicitly doing, right? So I know we talked about this concept of, implicit versus explicit risk management. And I think this is a really important concept when we talk to boards, because what this allows you to do is to take kind of this traditional view of things where, we are applying controls based on a framework or best practice. If those controls are effective, we have implicitly lowered the risk that the organization is facing or improved our security posture, right? And these things are true. I mean, that is an accurate statement for the most part. But the challenge is when you start to get specific questions. What are we doing about risk X, or how much exposure do we have for this? To do that, you have to get to this explicit view of risk, right? And this is that top-down approach, and this is the where FAIR excels. When we look at a specific scenario to a particular asset, what is our exposure to this risk, right? What is our loss exposure in financial terms? Are we comfortable with that? And if we're not comfortable with that, what are the specific things that we can do to address that? I know when we talked to your board, there was some discussion about use cases and how to actually make this work. And one of those that I thought was a great example is, how do we take a risk that we have, talk about 2 or 3 different options on how to address that risk, and show specifically how those are going to play out. So we can look at a particular risk that has 3, in the case of the example we used, there were 3 different options to treat this. They had very different costs, they had very different impacts, but it allowed us to then say, well, what this one is doing is reducing the likelihood of this thing happening at all, right? And strategically, that's more important to us than minimizing the loss once something does happen, right? We can start to talk about that in strategic terms and be specific, right? So that instead of the board getting a page of metrics about the effectiveness of controls, we can say how we're addressing specific risks in a way that aligns to that strategy, and then shows that, what's the cost benefit of that at the end of the day. And I think that, that's a really powerful way to talk, and it's something that you just can't do with other methods.
Yeah, I don't know, Vince, if this particular slide leaps off to the page for folks, but I want to make sure that it does, because this one is such a powerful concept. The other way that I sometimes think about this same movement from implicit to explicit is the move from possibility, where we talk in terms of, what is possible. I'll never forget a scenario that we received as part of the input for us to put in front of Vince and team, that included a volcanic eruption. And you go, that's a great risk to bring forward, but we're really talking about what's possible here, not what's probable. And so moving down this continuum towards explicit, being able to break down those scenarios like the one that you just mentioned into the three different outcomes and really drive a discussion around what are we looking to limit? Are we trying to limit the cost to recover, the cost to repair, or are we trying to limit our exposure to potential client loss? And what was so neat about, Vince actually took the board through this example. What was so neat about that was the board immediately understood it's about the clients. It's about minimizing that potential impact. That's where we need to be focused in terms of our actual strategy. And that to me is the power of moving to explicit, the ability to break it down. Remembering those three questions. Is it useful? We answered that. And is it defensible? It is, because we've got a model to actually leverage as we do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, maybe this is a good segue to talk a little bit about, how you wanted to meet this ask and how you wanted to present this powder, this proof of concept, back to the board, right? And, if you want, I can give a little bit of an overview of the project that we worked on, that Protiviti worked on with you. But I think that this was a really good example, because what we did was we took this mandate to, come back at the next board meeting, show us something different, show us how this can be done, answer those three questions that Matt talked about in the beginning. And in order to do this, we wanted to take an approach where we looked at a variety of different risk scenarios or loss event scenarios across the environment. So we didn't want to just focus on cyber or just financial risk or these types of things. And so what we did is we identified a set of representative scenarios, and we ended up coming up with about 19 scenarios. And the goal of this was not necessarily to quantify the quote unquote top risks, but to quantify interesting risks or things that are hard to understand in qualitative terms. And also we added a mix of ones where we quote unquote had good data, and those that we felt like we didn't have as much information or as much quantitative data around. And I think what that did is it gave you a portfolio of scenarios. And again, understanding the objective of the analysis is really important, is that the goal here is to show the board, again, is this something that we can do? Is this something that's useful? And I think by doing that, you can show kind of, here's what the whole spectrum looks like. We went through this exercise. Yeah,
Vince,
go ahead.
I'll just add, key to the decision making in the way we set up the scope was really two pieces of input. I mentioned earlier how I had spoken with other like-kind institutions on their journey, and many of them would start with a top-down assessment. And so that was one of the key elements. I mentioned having a partner, and I think having a partner that's engaged with the FAIR Institute, as Protiviti is, that actually has a track record of producing these kinds of results for board readout was another key element. And then I think the last one was taking that same domain approach, interviewing the top leadership for the risk department that actually represented the programs that are trying to manage that risk. Getting from them what was top of mind from a scenario perspective was the way that we thought we could build from that top down and have good representation across. So I just thought those were 3 points worth adding to that.
Yeah, no, that's great. And, and I think with that, the goal of this was, again, to go back to the board and to show them, this is something that we can do. And is this going to be helpful? Is this something that we can do in the business? Yeah.
Is this something we can do quickly, right, Vince? I mean, I think we should mention, we really set for ourselves a very rapid timetable on purpose. We wanted to show progress to the board. We wanted to be able to come back the very next quarter and actually show them progress. And I would mention, if you're not going to mention at the end, Vince, this is all being done as COVID is just hopping onto the scene. So literally we started the engagement together in the middle of February, and just several weeks in, COVID hits and suddenly it's all virtual.
That's right. Yeah. And, but, and I guess, the testament to that is that, it could be done. And, we were able to get through 19 different scenarios across the whole company, across different domains, some very traditional and some not so much. And, we put this together, as, again, to go back to the board and to show them, how did this go? Is this something that we can do? Is this useful? And then if we do want to go forward with this, what does that look like? Which is a good kind of segue into the session that we just held with the board to go and show this result. And, and I've just put up here real quick the agenda from that meeting. And, I think this is something that's really useful. It's important to start with a little bit of a background, which, talked about, again, a reminder of why we're doing this. And then I think, something that I was very glad that you included was a discussion about why, right? Why are we doing this? Not just because this is more mature or this is fancier, this gives us cooler graphs, but again, why are we doing this? And what is the industry doing? And having an open and honest discussion about that was very helpful. And I think that resonated with the board very well because it added some context, right? It made this not just an academic exercise anymore.
That's right.
Yep. And then, from that, we talked about kind of the top risk view of this. And I think what was good about that is that, we took one story through to the board. It's very easy to overwhelm the board with, these quantitative results and all these charts and these graphs and all of this math. But I think, as we did, we worked through kind of from the very top, a key area or risk domain down to a specific loss event scenario, down to the specific insights that you were able to glean from that scenario, which were, I think very good and non-intuitive, which is, something that's very helpful. It showed that there is value in doing this. You were able to learn things through this analysis that you would not have necessarily figured out otherwise, and show them that example. And I think that had a very good conversation around that. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I think that was a really strong approach to that, and we'll talk in just a second about kind of their response to that. And then finally, what was your proposal? Coming to the board with a plan was very important. And I think the very first question that the board asked, if you recall, was, what are you asking of us? Are you asking for permission? Are you telling us what you're doing? Or are you trying to see how we'll respond to this? And I think, thinking through that is very important. And you had a well thought out and a developed plan to go forward. And with that, I wanted to show kind of just a graphic because, no board presentation would be complete without some graphics. And this is just an example that, that we anonymized out of the material that you presented. And I think when we talk about, going from that metrics view, that dashboard with 50 metrics on it, to understanding what the board really wants and being able to answer that in plain English, right? And if you can read this, we looked at the top risks from 3 different lenses, right? What single event could cost us the most if it happens, right? What's the worst bad day scenario, right? Which of these are likely to exceed our current risk appetite, right? What's the probability of that exceeding it in the next year? And then finally, which of these are going to have the greatest annualized loss exposure? Meaning, which of these are the things that are probably going to cost us the most in the near term? And that's just that's something that you just can't do with tables of metrics. It doesn't tell that story. And I think that this resonated very well, right?
It totally did. You still had the ability to articulate that possibility, right? So that part of the storyline isn't being left off the table. In fact, if anything, we're reframing it and putting it into context. And then I think what was exciting to the board was the idea that we would have a set of risk appetite statements that go all the way up to board level and then allow us to roll down to the business unit level. I don't know how it is at other companies, but this is often a disconnect. We have, appetite set at the top in very broad terms, and then we've got appetite set very, at the very bottom of the organization in really micro terms. But being able to have one that's consistent all the way through that continuum is just incredibly powerful. And then to your point earlier, what should I be focused on to be able to think about where is my annual loss exposure greatest? Where am I most likely to have a loss? Just again, creates a level of context that drives meaningful conversation. And again, back to that opening slide that we led with, that's kind of what they were saying. If we sum it all up, I'm not so sure that we want to. Our time is best spent debating metrics. Our time is best spent looking at where that greatest loss is and ensuring that we've done everything possible to mitigate it.
And yeah, maybe that's a great place to lead off with. And I think we're out of time here. But Matt, thanks again for sharing this story. This is really exciting stuff. Matt and I will both be in the comments area to answer any questions that you have. And Matt, thanks again, and I look forward to working with you again soon.
Thanks for hosting, Vince, and best of luck, everyone, with your journey towards FAIR.